Hello. Today marks the start of a 4-part series that is all about how we perform in our lives. And typically this podcast releases every other week, but for this 4-part series, we're going to do every single week because they all go together. And I want you to start recognizing how you might be performing in your life. What does that mean? How does it show up? And how do you start to question it so that you can break free and really live unapologetically as you without the weight of those shoulds and supposed tos and feeling like you have to perform in your life instead of just live it. So we're going to dive into that over the next 4 weeks. And this is really, we're getting into the run up to the release of Grounded Wildness, which I am just ecstatic about. It feels like we've been working on this forever, and the pre-sale started way back in May at this point, and it's getting real now. It'll be out this fall and the pre-sale is on now. So if you want to get that, you can go to my website, which is heatherwhelpley.com/grounded wildness. We'll put a link in the show notes as well. Cause yeah, this is it's all part of that bigger picture and that goal for you to really feel free in your life, to break the rules with purpose and to live in joy and freedom and to challenge and create change while you're doing that. So this all goes together. It's all what Grounded Wildness is. But for today, we are just going to dive into the performing. And maybe you already know how you're performing in your life. Like maybe that immediately resonates with you, or maybe not. Maybe you've never thought about that before. So if not, I want to give you some context before we dive in, and then we'll get into proving, which is our first topic of how we perform in our lives, proving, which was personally the biggest way I performed in my life was around proving. So we'll dive into all of that. But to give you a little bit of background, we all start out in our lives in what I call a stage of youthful wildness. So where those rules have not yet impacted you, you don't feel the weight of societal expectations and cultural expectations and should and supposed to and how you're supposed to be. And we've all been around kids, so you know exactly what I'm talking about. And you probably remember this from your own life as well. I remember even as late as 6th grade, just totally following my own drummer. Like I did not care hardly what people thought. Like I had friends, and of course I occasionally was like, ooh, what do they think? But really, nope, really, I just followed my own desires, my own style. Like nothing in my style was the way it was supposed to be. And yes, this was 1992 and things were a little crazy, but I took that up to even a higher level. Like I remember my favorite outfit in 6th grade was a hand-me-down from my mom, partly. It was like this green kind of cotton top and pants, like matching cotton top and pants, because I hated jeans. I did not understand why anyone would ever wear jeans. My first pair of jeans was actually in 6th grade, and even then I hated them. So cotton and elastic were my friend. I thought those were a lot better than any sort of stiff jeans material. So I had this green, like Kelly green suit, essentially, like, but not fancy suit, like matching pantsuit almost, or sweatsuit. And then I tied this bright, thick rainbow belt around my waist. And then had these salamander earrings that, I'm not kidding, went from my ears all the way down to my shoulders, just these giant salamanders. And on my feet were my favorite pair of shoes ever, this pair of Keds with all of these bright colors on them. So you can probably start to create a picture of what I looked like. And I loved this outfit. Like I loved it. And not only that, but I spoke up and I sang and I used my voice and I did the things that were like, I wrote and I was creative and I painted and just all of the things. Like I just didn't worry about the rules. I didn't worry about how I was supposed to be showing up. I just showed up as me. And that's what I call youthful wildness. And then at some point, you start to feel the weight and the impact of those rules and those shoulds and supposed tos. And this is what I call the section of our life that is the years of performing. And for me, this started in 7th grade. And some people it's earlier, some people it's later. And mine was a very quick transition. I think for a lot of people, it's probably a little bit more gradual. But for me, I moved schools and districts from 6th grade to 7th grade, and not just schools, but like I went to an alternative elementary school, then went to a traditional middle school. And on the whole, this transition was fantastic. Like, I don't think anyone really has an amazing middle school experience, but the reality is, I think mine was almost as good as it can be. And even with that, even with looking back and being like, I wasn't bullied, nothing horrible happened, like all of these things, I still just absolutely sprinted towards performing when I got into 7th grade. I suddenly started feeling like, ooh, am I cool enough? And what am I supposed to say? And maybe I shouldn't wear that outfit that I loved because no one else is dressing like that here. And it seems like people actually care versus my other school. No one dressed like me either, but also no one cared. And do I look the way that I'm supposed to look? And should I start, should school be more serious? And all of these weights, and really most of it for me was social at that point. Like, how am I supposed to show up so that I can fit in, so that boys will like me, so that I'll have the friends that I want to have, and just be more like other people instead of just like myself. And it does not surprise me looking back that I gained 30 pounds in the first semester of 7th grade. Like, all of that performing had to have a release somewhere. And for me, that release for a long, long time came through binging, came through binge eating. It was like a release from my performing needed to come through in some way. So that was like my initial sprint into the years of performing in 7th grade. And then performing showed up in different ways later in my life. Like, I got feedback in my corporate career that I could be too direct, which on the surface isn't terrible feedback, but some awareness around that is good. But I took it too much to heart. And I think that feedback was based in bias. And I started to filter myself over time. So not just be emotionally intelligent and thoughtful with my voice, but really filter it and be overly cautious about how I spoke up, how I use my voice, like asking questions instead of sharing a direct opinion, or worrying about it after the fact when I did share my voice and wondering if I hurt someone's feelings, all of this like circling up in my head. And that filtering, that over filtering, is a way of performing. Now, I want to be clear, performing is not it's not about being totally inauthentic. Maybe it could be if that feels right to you, but I never really felt inauthentic. I felt like the parts I was showing were real, but there was like this whole other part of me that I either wasn't showing or was heavily filtering. So I was authentic, but not full and not unapologetically myself, and not bringing all of that forward. So what I shared, or who I was, didn't feel fake, but there was just so much more of me that was being filtered and held back. And this is all performing. And then at some point, you go through what I call the break. There starts to get cracks in those rules and that performing, and you start to question. And this is what leads into grounded wildness. And I'm not going to talk about that right now, that break and how you break away from performing, but I will do an episode on it after we do this four session series on how you perform in your life. So know that we will come back to that in September. You'll get an episode all about that. And of course, that is detailed in a lot of stories and resources and questions in the book as well, because the break is what changed my life. And so we'll come back to that, and also know that you can read about all of that in Grounded Wildness and what it means to you as well. So performing. So that's some context on like, what are the stages we go through? Youthful wildness, the years of performing, the break, and then finally into grounded wildness. And you might find yourself anywhere along that spectrum. Most people I meet, I mean, myself included for many years, and still to a degree, are somewhere in those years of performing. I feel like now I'm like 85% grounded wildness, 15% performing. And I'm working on amping that up, being more in grounded wildness and even less in performing. But it used to be more like 60 or 70%, grounded wildness and 40% performing, if not more, maybe more than that. And so this performing, when I talk about it, I want to share a quote from Grounded Wildness that describes what it is, because it's a great wording. So here's that quote. Performing is anything that takes you away from you. It's the front you put on that covers up your true desires and emotions. It's the armor you use to protect yourself from the judgment, criticism, and sideways glances that indicate you've broken some unwritten rule about how you're supposed to show up. It's the words, actions, and decisions that feel just a little bit off, even if you can't quite put your finger on why. That, in a nutshell, is performing. So what comes up for you when I say that? What is that judgment? What are those ways that you've noticed, ooh, I broke some unwritten rule there by not performing, so I think I better shift. I think I better shift who I am, chameleon a little bit, in order to perform. And performing falls into 4 different categories: proving, pleasing, perfecting, and rebelling. And that's what we're going to dive into over each of these next 4 weeks: the proving, the pleasing, the perfecting, and the rebelling. And I know rebelling sounds totally like out of place in that category or in that grouping, but believe me, it is much of a performance trap as the other 3. And on a high level, the difference between them is that proving, pleasing, and perfecting is all about conforming to the rules. So you are performing to live up to the expectations that have been laid out to you, to the rules that have been handed to you, to the messages that you've been given about how you're supposed to show up, what it means to be a good girl, a good woman, a good employee, just good in general. All of those things, like you're conforming to or performing in an attempt to live up to those expectations. And those go across your entire life: work, parenthood, being a daughter, being a sister, being a friend, being the way you think about your body, money, house. I mean, just everything. How you think about gender and sexuality and relationships, they go across everything, everything. So proving, pleasing, and perfecting are all conforming towards those rules. Rebelling is pushing against them, not with purpose, but on purpose. So you're pushing against the rules and breaking them even when it doesn't actually align to you. And that is the difference. It's still a performance. And we'll dive way deeper into that when we get to that. So proving, pleasing, and perfecting, those are about conforming. Rebelling is about pushing against. And today we're going to dive into that first one around proving. And I want to be clear before we get into any of this, like hopefully if you've been here, maybe this is your first podcast episode you're ever listening to. So I want to be very clear. This performing is not your fault. It comes from those rules, from those messages, from your personal experiences, from everything that is external to you. Your youthful wildness was you, and then the avalanche of rules came upon you and pushed you to perform, essentially. That is not your fault. That is the fault of our cultural rules, the expectations, the everything that was handed to you about how you are supposed to show up. So no guilt, no shame, no judgment for following any of these or any of it. But just today, like, get curious. I'm not here to provide answers for you today. I really want you to just get curious and start to notice, how might you be performing in your life? How might you be proving in your life? Because you can't change any of it. You can't start to break the rules with purpose unless you know how you're showing up now, unless you know how you are proving, unless you know how you are performing. So just be curious today and stay open and start noticing what comes up for you as I share stories and ask questions. And then after the podcast too, I think this is one of those places where you notice You notice the rules long after you start hearing about them, and you notice like, oh, wait, I just totally performed in that situation. I felt like I had to prove myself and I twisted myself in order to do so. Maybe I can make a different decision. Maybe I can challenge the rule I was handed that made me feel like I had to do that in the first place. So just get curious and notice. Proving was the biggest way that I performed in my life, without a doubt. Pleasing and perfecting were there, along with like a little bit of rebelling. I think I actually could have rebelled a lot more in my life. If I'm being honest, it might have been helpful in my younger years to rebel a little bit more, but proving was definitely the biggest way that everything came up for me. So it really showed up in two different ways in my life. The first one was all around overachieving and overdoing, and feeling like I had to prove myself through achievement and saying yes to everything and doing well and being successful the first time I tried something, especially in school, then later in work, and then in my, and then running a business as well. So there was like a thread throughout all those, which didn't mean I followed the traditional path all the time, but there was still always this overdoing, overachieving sense that I had. And then I finally stopped to ask myself why. And this word proving was the first thing that came up for me, like, oh, I'm doing it to prove myself. And my first book, An Overachiever's Guide to Breaking the Rules, this is what the whole book is about. I mean, the second chapter, or first, I think it's the first chapter, is actually called, What Are You Proving? Like, that's what it is. It was asking the reader, what are you proving? But it also shared my story, because that was the biggest question that had like such a great answer for me, because it led down this initial deep dive of like, where am I proving in my life and why? What's behind that? And proving was essentially, I was proving my worth through overdoing and overachievement. What I didn't totally realize at the time, though, was that there was a whole other layer to this proving that was deeper. It was harder to talk about. It was harder to explore. And that was related to this whole conglomeration of like my body and dating and men, because I mentioned I gained 30 pounds in 7th grade. So I went from being a very healthy weight to being in a larger body, especially when you're in 7th grade. Interestingly, I actually weigh about the same now, just a little bit less now than what I did then, and think of myself as a totally average weight. But in 7th grade, I was so ashamed of that. I was so ashamed of my body and the way that it looked, and that it didn't look the way it was supposed to, that it wasn't desirable to, in our culture as a whole, it wasn't desirable to me. It especially wasn't desirable to boys at that time, and then men as I got older. And I gained more weight after that, kind of slowly and steadily in college. And so I was in, a larger body for pretty much all of my teen and young adult years. And during that entire time, I was totally ashamed of my body. I wasn't ashamed of everything about me, not at all, but I was ashamed of my body and felt like not just that something was wrong with my body, but that something was wrong with me for not being able to lose weight, for not being able to control myself, for not being able to make my body look the way that it was supposed to look, this thin, wayfish, no curves, tiny body, desirable image that I had been handed from all the messages around me. I think a lot of us were handed, if you're around my age, that was like pretty much the standard of beauty that a lot of us were handed at that age. And that's what I got. And I took that in really deeply, and I could see like how I looked versus what I felt like I was supposed to look. And there was a big gap in between those two. And I wanted to like live up to that standard, but I didn't know how. I didn't know how to do it. I didn't know how to follow the rules in this part of my life. I would have if I could have figured it out at the time, but I didn't know how. And that's what caused that shame, was because I just simply couldn't live up to the expectation. And that caused proving. So it caused proving just in general, like it was interestingly connected to the overdoing and overachieving, because I felt like, okay, this is an area I can control. I can do well. I can do well. If I just work hard enough, I can do well at most things that I want to do well at. I can do well in leadership. Like I wasn't always like the best sports person, but I was captain of both the teams that I was on. I worked at my church. I did well in school. I did da-da-da. I mean, just like the list goes on. This was an area I knew I could do well in my life to make up for the areas, my body, dating or lack thereof, all of that I just I didn't feel good about. I was ashamed about. Things weren't happening in that section of my life. And so I overdid in this other one. And over time, looking back as an adult, I realized even way into my adulthood, like just a couple years ago, it's embarrassing to say, but it's true. Even though I lost weight, which shouldn't have anything to do with it, but I was in a smaller body, I still carried that shame around with me of those past experiences and feeling like I wasn't desirable to men. And so therefore I proved in all these other areas, like I didn't feel desirable, but I did feel like I was adventurous and lively and fun and smart and like other good things about me. I believe those were all true. Didn't think I was horrible. It was just like this one section of my life that I felt like I was broken and ashamed. And so these other parts I like way overdid and tried to point out all the things we had in common and like listen to the things they recommended and read the books they recommended and post things on social media that would be like, show that I'm just super fun and adventurous and like, you should like me. And it is, like I said, I feel like this is the behavior of a 13-year-old and I was doing it in my 30s, but hopefully some of you will resonate with it because we all do prove in different ways. And this is where I was proving. I was trying to make up for my feeling like my body was broken, feeling like I was broken because I couldn't do it. I mean, all of those things. And I used to think that this whole concept of worthiness, which is really what's underlying proving, like you're trying to prove that you're worthy of love, of belonging, in my case, being desired, all of these things. I used to think it was all or nothing, like either you thought you were worthy or you didn't. And I often heard the phrase like worthy of love and belonging. And that didn't resonate with me because I always felt like I was worthy of love. Like I had great friendships. I had good connections with my family. Like I didn't believe that those were undeserved. But then when it got to my body and dating, that is the part where I felt unworthy. And it took actually listening to a podcast with Esther Perel was on it and she was talking and she was the one who initially differentiated between feeling worthy of being loved versus feeling worthy of being desired. And I was like, yes, I've never heard that distinction before. And that is exactly how I feel. So for me, it was like piecemealed, where a good portion of my self-esteem, my confidence, how I felt about myself was good. It was solid. It was good. And then there was this other part of me that I just tried to shove into the shadows and prove and perform my way into covering it up and making up for it with the whole rest of my activities and life and work and friendships and everything else. But unfortunately, that is not the way it works because I never had anything to prove in the first place, and neither do you. But yet, this is such a core part of performing. I was trying to prove I was worthy because I didn't feel like all of me was enough just the way it was. And in particular, I didn't feel like my body was good enough just the way that it was. So this was my story. And really, any action that you take to prove your worthiness in any way, shape, or form, that's proving. That's performing via proving. And here's some other ways that it can show up. Like some of it is some of those rules or just feelings like feeling like you have to do it all on your own to like prove you can hack it or prove you can do it all on your own, prove that you're a strong, independent woman, prove that you don't need help from anyone. Just like I can do it all on my own and prove that you've got this essentially. Another way it can show up is like feeling like you always have to be productive, or that resting is lazy because you're proving yourself through achievement and productivity, feeling like when you try something new, it has to be successful the very first time you're doing it. And that's because that's connected into your worth, that like doing it well is a part of your identity and your worth. Another one is around thinking you have to keep it all together. Like you have to be under control, in control. You have to keep it all together. You shouldn't show some of those emotions. And some of this is connected in with pleasing and perfecting as well. They definitely overlap. But this feeling of like, I have to show my best image all the time, or I have to show people like, I'm fine. I've got this. I put on a happy face and keep on rolling, even if you're like crumbling on the inside, because if people saw the crumbling, if they saw what was really happening on the inside, then you wouldn't be worthy of being hired by them, of being their friend, of being their partner, of whatever it is. So you have to like hide those parts or filter them out to show and prove that you're worthy, because those messy parts are not part of your worthiness, which is incorrect, but that's how it can feel. And then even just things like feeling like I have to show them that I deserve to be an employee on their team. I have to deserve them, that they show them that I deserve to be their friend or their partner, like any kind of this feeling like I have to show them that I deserve to be here, deserve to be in this relationship, deserve this opportunity. And again, this is beyond just like sharing your competency, showing up as a, a decent human in a reciprocal relationship, things like that. This is like above and beyond that is what I'm talking about. Showing them that you have to like prove yourself, prove your worthiness, prove that you deserve to be there. These are all ways of proving. And sometimes this can show up, if you feel like you have to prove, then you don't have good boundaries, or you say yes to too many things. And yeah, it all can interconnect there. So it can show up in different behaviors, but I think especially with this one, it's more of a feeling. So perfecting and pleasing, we're going to get into some really core behaviors. And I think you could actually argue that especially around perfecting, that worthiness is actually the root cause of that one too, but they're worth talking about very separately because they can show up differently. Proving is a feeling more than anything. You feel like you have to prove yourself or just prove one little part of you. So I encourage you to think about that. Are there sections of your life or sections of your being, parts of who you are, that you feel like you have to prove yourself when maybe everything else feels fine? Like that was mine. I think I'd never heard anyone talk about it that way. So hopefully that's helpful to you, because that was like so helpful to me to be like, oh, wait, I can be confident and feel great about 90% of who I am and feel like 100% broken in this other 10%. That was my truth for a really long time. And so, yeah, taking a breath here, taking a breath to regroup. I want to ask you, where are you proving in your life? And if you don't feel that now, has it shown up for you in the past? And if you aren't sure, just start to notice after this podcast is ended, like, where do you feel like you need to prove yourself? If this is part of the way that you perform, just notice, be curious, no judgment. We have to recognize these places that we're performing before we can break some of those rules and truly start to live in that grounded wildness and recognize that you were never broken. 10% of you was broken, never broken. 100% of you is never broken. No part of you was ever broken or in need of proving. But you have to start to recognize the way you feel now before you can change any of that. So start to notice. It is a journey. It is a journey. So just for today, just start to ponder and notice and get curious. And then next week, we're going to cover pleasing, people pleasing. This is one I know impacts a whole lot of people. I know it because it shows up when I talk about the ways of pleasing in my speaking engagements. People are like, oh yeah, I do that. And I'll tell you, I had some interesting realizations around people pleasing because I never thought of myself much as a people pleaser. And then when I started to dig into deeper layers, I was like, oh yeah, that does actually show up for me in a few different ways. So I will both share some of my stories and some of my misperceptions about what people pleasing was. And I had some misperceptions around perfectionism too, because I didn't ever think of myself as a perfectionist for a long time, and then realized it did show up in some pretty big ways that were that were influencing my life and the way I showed up and how I felt about how I showed up. Different ways of performing. So pleasing will be next week. So come back, and that episode is going to be shorter because this one we had to go into all the context and background. And next time we'll just dive right into people pleasing. And if any of this is resonating with you, any of it's speaking to you, or you want to learn more about performing, but even more so, how you actually break free from it, what grounded wildness can look like for you, how you get grounded and wild in your life, the practices, the things that you can do and think about and reflect on in order to move in that direction, get the book, Grounded Wildness. It is, if you're listening to this when we're first released, which is August of 2023, it is available for pre-sale on my website, which is heatherwhelpley.com/grounded wildness. If you're listening to the future, it'll still be available on my website. And at some point it'll be out on Amazon and audiobooks. I'm recording the audiobook in just a couple of weeks, which will be really fun. So that'll be out there, paperback, ebook. So eventually it'll all be out there. But for right now, if you want to be one of the first people to get your hands on Grounded Wildness and get it right when it's released this fall, like shipped to you, hopefully so that you are getting it on the actual day, like I'll ship it to you before the actual release date, go get the book now, heatherwhelpley.com/grounded wildness. And I'll put the link in the show notes as well. So yeah, proving, performing, that's what we dove into today. And next week, it's all about pleasing so that we can break these rules and start living in grounded wildness, breaking the rules with purpose, living in greater joy and freedom, creating change for yourself, and feeling the release of the weight of that performing. That's what I've been through in the last couple of years, and I want whatever version of that is for you, I want for you as well. Joy, freedom, impact. See you next week.